Thank you everyone for coming in person. Even though it's raining, it was raining a little bit earlier. And thank you everyone for joining in from Zoom as well. So the presentation today is going to be about a thesis that I wrote in the last year. It's about demographic leverage and ethnic gerrymandering in a changing Nepal. So the session is simply going to be like, I'll give a brief presentation, probably around 30 minutes on the thesis itself. I'll talk about my hypotheses, I'll talk about the research methodology, and then the results that I got, and then we're gonna open the round for questions from the audience. People in the Zoom, please feel free to add in questions at any point. We'll just address it towards the end, but you can add questions at any point. Feel free to do so. Okay, so we can start. I'll give you a brief info about myself. My name is Sonam Sherpa. I am a graduating senior. I'm graduating next week. Basically, I'm gonna be done with all my projects and papers, and it's a little weird because I can't look at the Zoom and the people at the same time. It's like at different areas, basically I grew up in Nepal. I grew up in the capital city of Nepal. I am very interested in Nepali history, society, and economics as well. And I concentrating in economics in Harvard. And this thesis is a result of a year-long work into finding like the data, which is very difficult in the Nepali context, writing the paper, and then submitting it finally during Thanksgiving break. It says demographic leverage and ethnic gerrymandering. Demographic leverage sounds like a huge term, but it simply means whether your community or whether you as a group can use your demographics to leverage your election outcomes, or like whether you can use your demographics, population demographics, as a benefit for elections. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions on that. And gerrymandering, I'll explain more about gerrymandering later on, but like an introduction. But the presentation today is simply going to be, I'm going to give a brief introduction to the topic, to a thesis. I'm going to give a small brief background on the Nepali society and history as well. Mention the hypotheses that I had, methodologies that I used, analysis that I came up with, and any questions that you may have. Introduction. So brief introduction on gerrymandering and the research questions that I had. So gerrymandering at its very core definition is simply the idea of using political boundaries to benefit your specific political party or racial or ethnic community. At its very core, that's the meaning of gerrymandering. The literature of gerrymandering initially began in the United States. The word gerrymandering came from the United States as well. It actually came from Massachusetts, where we are staying where we are right now. And US has a long legal, academic history, academic literature behind gerrymandering. And my effort in this thesis was to export some of that literature, export some of that findings or methodologies they use to the Nepali context. An example of gerrymandering is this case of Alabama, which is a state in the US, where African Americans, for instance, represent like 26% of the share of the overall state population, but if there's only one majority Black district out of 7. This went to the Supreme Court as well as a case. And you can see, like, even though they represent like 25%, they only have like actually substantively control like 14% of the district in the state. So this is a potential sign of gerrymandering. The exact specifics of what gerrymandering means in the US is like a legal question more so than has been a legal question. And I don't think all of that is necessarily relevant to the Nepali context, but the academic part of what gerrymandering has been is relevant. Another more stark example of gerrymandering in the US is this district map of North Carolina, where you can see there is like 13 maps, and like 3 specific maps are like very weirdly drawn, like 1, 4, and 12. And these are like majority Black districts as well. And these are the districts that went to the Democrats. But the share of Democrats in the state is 50%. So this is like a more starker example of gerrymandering that happened in 2012 and 2014. And like you can imagine drawing a hypothetical Democratic congressional map where the Democrats win nine out of 13 seats with the same vote proportion, basically. And you can have a more nonpartisan map as well. So this is what gerrymandering looks like graphically. The research question then that I have is, first, do we observe potential signs of gerrymandering in electoral maps in Nepal? Second is, what is generally the share of demographic political power across communities and whether that's fair? What ought to be an equitable share of political power is more of a normative question that economics can try to answer, but it does not really try to answer. It's more of a opinion that you come up with as an individual, or you can have like debates in political science, but economics doesn't really go towards like what is equitable. But we can have differing views, differing opinions, and we can talk about that as well later on. Background. So brief background on Nepali socioeconomic and caste history. So broadly, this is very broad because Nepal, there's like 123 caste and ethnic groups. There's like 100 different languages spoken. So it's like an incredibly diverse place. But you can like broadly divide them into like 4 social groups. And this obviously misses some nuance as well. That like you obviously miss, you're generalizing a little bit when you're like dividing them into like bigger social groups. But I think a lot of academics in the literature use this as a guiding social group classification. So I use the same as well. So it's 4 groups. The biggest group is Baun Chhetri, which is, I'm going to talk more about like all the groups independently as well, but these are like the 4 groups and their respective proportions. So firstly, what are Baun Chhetri and Dalits? For people who are not from Nepal, this might seem a little confusing because they're essentially the same people, like with the same language, like same ethnic history, same like migration history, like same like cultural history, same religion, everything is the same. They also like look incredibly similar for somebody who's from the outside. The only difference is that they belong to like different levels in the caste hierarchy. Bound specifically refers to people who belong to like the top caste. Chhetri refers to people in the second, the warrior caste, and Dalit refers to people on the bottom of the caste hierarchy, people who are who have been historically deemed untouchable. This discrimination has been going on for like 2,500 years in Nepal's history, in Indian history. Like even like in Buddha's time, for instance, there are like written like records of like Buddha having to deal with the caste problem, for instance. So this is like a huge problem for like a long time. But the weird thing is that essentially it's like they have this, they're like very, very similar people, especially compared to the other 2 groups. And one more thing, they're like mostly dwell in the hills. All these groups, they are native to the western hills of Nepal specifically. The second group are known as Madhesi people. So Madhesi people are people who are native to southern Nepal. They are culturally, linguistically, in terms of religion, in terms of affinities, are very similar to people like social groups in North India. They have like similar languages, similar customs, and like huge history of like intermarriage as well. So because of this proximity to like North Indian like social groups and the perceived distance from the elite in the capital, they have historically been disenfranchised. They've historically been like left out of the national narrative, for instance. They have been left out of who is a Nepali, who gets social political rights in Nepal. And these people are native to the southern plains of Nepal specifically. And the 4th group are indigenous groups, and they're like, this is not a specific like one group. There's like 59 different officially recognized groups, basically, all with their own language, own history, and all of them are like native to different parts of the country rather than any specific part. They assert their indigeneity in different regions of the country, basically. One thing that might look a little weird for somebody who's not from Nepal is like why these groups are indigenous, even though like all the groups are native to different parts of Nepal. And it is an interesting question, like why these groups specifically choose to assert their indigeneity over other groups. And like to answer that or to understand that, you have to go back in history before like the state of Nepal was formed. Before the state of Nepal was formed around like the 18th century, there were like huge amount, like significant number of kingdoms, like 100 different kingdoms all over the country, basically, and all over, like all ruled independently, all ruled with different chieftains. Some were like big enough to be called kingdoms, but they're mostly like principalities or like small like states, basically, instead of like actual huge kingdoms. And all of them had their like own rulers, like own history, own culture, own language. And when the state of Nepal was formed through like conquest, military conquest, all of these groups were formed into a group, or all these groups were formed into the same country, but they retained their like ancestral homes, and retained their like culture and language, and they still persist today. And it is to assert and like right now it's incredibly like the distribution of population is like incredibly spread out in Nepal, for instance. Like people like even every part of Nepal, you'll find like people from all those four ethnic groups, all those four social groups. So the socio-economic, social-political assertion of indigeneity comes from the fact that they want to claim indigeneity in like specific regional areas. Like for instance, like this is the Rai people from Eastern Nepal. They do not say that they're like indigenous all over Nepal, for instance. They say that it's indigenous specifically to Eastern Nepal, Eastern Hills specifically. And all of these other groups also have like a specific understanding of like what their ancestral homeland is and where they are like mostly situated. And they're mostly population-wise, they're mostly situated in those specific regions. Okay. So when the state of Nepal was formed around the 18th century, this was the first like written constitution of Nepal that divided all the groups into different caste groups, basically. And the interesting thing about this is that it essentially included like non-Hindu groups into the caste hierarchy as well, even though they did not have a conception of the caste system before that. So for instance, you can see like the Baun Kshatri are groups that are represented here in the high caste, and Dalits are people who are deemed untouchable at the bottom of the caste hierarchy. But there are also the indigenous people that I talked about, who are like mostly non-Hindu, have been included in the middle as a liquor drinking group, because the like liquor is a significant part of their culture, has been a significant part of their culture throughout history. And there are like Muslims and foreigners included in there too. The the division that was created like 250 years ago basically persists today, where, for instance, the probability of whether an individual falls under the poverty line is dependent based on the group that they belong to. This is a different division of social group that some academics use specifically to analyze like socioeconomic outcomes. And you can see, like, for instance, over here, like Hill Brahmin, which is like the bound, like, which is what like bounds are, as opposed to like Madhesi bound, because like it gets a little complicated when you divide based on the caste, because Madhesi community also has like the caste, they also have their like Brahmin, Kshatri, they also have Dalits as well. But you can see like Brahmin, Kshatri in the plains or the hill like do far better than other groups in general, especially like the Dalits. And Janajati refers to the ethnic groups. This is like the term in the subcontinent, basically. Yeah, this is the poverty probability index. There are like other socioeconomic measures that you can use to find out what like how privilege is distributed today as well. Like you can think in terms of wealth, in terms of income, you can think in terms of like land ownership or like political inclusion, and like you can see similar trends as well. So post 2007 is when there were massive changes in Nepal, and this is very important for our thesis, because there are three major changes basically. First, the Nepal became like a secular state after the end of its Hindu religion as a state religion, and it declared secular ethos basically. And then it also became a federal state from a centralized nation. So there were like 7 new provinces that were created. Local governments decreased significantly in number from like 3,100 all the way to 753. They were made smaller, more compact, and bigger. They were more bigger in size because of the decrease in number. And then also the third most important part was like the introduction of representative democracy from the 250-year-old monarchy that was replaced basically with a parliamentary democracy. The hypothesis that we had for the project was came initially for me from this map specifically. You can see this map represents the local governments that different groups represent the biggest group in. So this does not really represent like the spatial map entirely, because this is like which group is the biggest group in the local governments before the change. And these local governments are like 3,100 and much smaller in number. So this is probably more representative of where like local pluralities lie. And like BCST is the bound Kshetri group that I used for the analysis, and you can see they're much more spread out than other groups, but the other groups are like have specific areas of concentration of where they are. For instance, Mughals live around the Western Hills, Gurungs live around Western Upper Hills, and Tamangs live around Central Hills around here. So given the history of Nepal, what I hypothesized was that political boundaries, even though they have been changed throughout the change in federalism, have been gerrymandered to maintain existing power hierarchies in a more decentralized state. This is more of a social studies, political science hypothesis that I came up with, because it is generally conceived that power is not easily let go of. So that is how I came up with this hypothesis. And the second hypothesis I had was the share of demographic leverage or demographic political power would follow the division of the caste ethnic groups that was initially introduced in 1854, the triangle that we saw earlier. So methodologies. I used 4 specific methodologies. I'm going to talk more about that in the analysis as well. And let me know if you have any questions, because they're not immediately clear, I think. The first is unnecessary overlaps. The idea is if you divide up socio-political boundaries more than is necessary, then people get more confused because there is an understanding of like what a political community is. For instance, if I belong to one local government, but my neighbor belongs to the same local government but belongs to a different federal electoral area, then like we cannot communicate to talk about which person is better for office, because we have like there is a blurring of lines. There's like a division within the political community of a local government. So I basically use a regression measure of unnecessary division of local governments into federal and provincial electoral areas. Then I use a difference in difference analysis, measuring the effect of the redistricting of federal electoral areas on how it affects different candidacy and election win for different social groups. The third is I use plurality areas, basically where different groups have are the biggest group, and like what share of electoral areas, what share of municipalities, local governments that different groups have pluralities in. And the fourth is a mean median difference, which simply like you take the mean, you take the median, and you subtract that, and you get the mean median difference. I'll talk more about what that represents statistically and like in this study as well. Okay. So analysis. First, unnecessary overlaps. This is a little difficult to see because this was the easiest map I could find. This was the best map I could find. But you can see here, for instance, the black line represents a local government. And this local government has been divided into half, into one exists within this provincial electoral area, and the other, these half belong to these provincial electoral area. So this means people over here and here, even though they belong to the same municipality, they elect the same mayor, they have the same local political discussions, they need to have a different discussion at the provincial level, which means that there is like a literature in the US specifically that has found like unnecessary divisions are correlated with like more voter confusion about who the candidate is. Also have issues with that voter mobilization in political like protests and like during the elections as well, and also has effects on like how much budget you get from different levels, because you are, instead of becoming like a bigger part of a specific constituency over like smaller parts of different areas instead, different levels instead. And the regression I ran is simple. Is like basically you measure the unnecessary overlap in an electoral area. Electoral area is simply like the electoral district. Basically, it's like which elects a representative. And you measure the share of a specific group. Like here, this is measuring the share of like Baun and Chetri percentage. And then you measure, and these are like controls more for like population size and like the number of overlaps in a district to control for like other third like omitted variables. So this is a result I got, which is I did not include all the different regressions for other groups as well, because either they were like mostly statistically insignificant, and these are the only statistically significant results I got. But you can see that, like for instance, like the share of Baun Chetri population, the log of that is like negatively correlated with unnecessary divisions between a local government and a provincial or federal electoral area they belong to. Especially in provincial government, for instance, it's like minus 0.16. And the way to interpret this, because it's a log, is that like if the population increases by 100%, unnecessary overlaps decrease by 0.16, minus 0.16. And at the same instance, like the share of Madhesi population is positively associated with unnecessary overlaps. This means like people, like Madhesi people, for instance, are more like have more greater challenges of like this confusion between political boundaries and stuff. In terms of its economic significance, this is a little better. It's like this is significantly better than the US context. Like when they did this study in the US, they had like results of like 5 minus 5, which means if you like a white population would have like an increase in white population would decrease the share like unnecessary overlaps by almost 5, which is like quite significant, or 5 unnecessary overlaps. This is much smaller in comparison, but the results do indicate like benefits to specific groups and disadvantages to others. I did this in provincial and federal elections. When you run both of them, the Baun Chetri population it becomes insignificant. I wonder if that's primarily because of the lack, or like because we don't really have a lot of observations in the federal election, especially, and in the provincial, like neither of them were significant. Okay, so difference. This is the second methodology I use, difference in difference. So the idea of difference in difference is simple. You analyze a group that went like a couple of groups that had like specific treatments observed into them, and you compare their outcomes before and after and see how the treatment affected the outcome basically. And to do a difference in difference analysis, I used a tool that happened like a tool in the federal electoral area during the change, which basically a federal electoral area is decreased from 240 to 165 during the change, during 2015. So 240 federal electoral districts, and that decreased to 165 later on. But the decrease wasn't like synchronous throughout it wasn't distributed equally throughout the country. Like there were some districts that received no change in electoral areas, some districts that received a decrease in 1, some districts that experienced a decrease in 2 or 3 electoral areas, basically. So I analyze these groups like separately and like put them into three different groups and like analyze their outcomes. And I analyze, like for instance, this is an example where like this is a district called Jhapa in eastern Nepal, where there were like 7 federal electoral area before the change, and that became 5. And there are like many other districts that also experienced a decrease in 2 or 3 electoral areas. So I compared them independently and saw what the results were. Specifically, I was interested in 2 different outcomes: the candidacy of different group, candidacy share of different groups, and the win of the electoral wins of different groups. So first, this is about candidacy share. So as basically you can see in the bottom that you're measuring minority candidacy, like minority candidates. I'm saying minority candidates, but like I'm measuring that for all the different groups as well. You're basically regressing post-treated and post treated. Post basically is an indicator for like whether it's before, like after the change. And treated is like an indicator variable which equals to 0 if there's no change in your district. If there's like one change in like one decrease, then this is equal to 1, and if it's 2 or 3, it's equal to 2. None of the results are statistically significant. We're most interested in these coefficients, but we can see that none of these results are statistically significant, which is a good thing, because this means that even though there was more decrease in some more decrease in electoral areas in some districts, like that did not necessarily lead to a lower share of candidacy for all these different groups, for instance. For election wins as well, all these are also statistically insignificant, except for Dalits, where the probability of being elected actually increased significantly after the treatment, after the decrease in electoral area. This is a good thing. This means that Dalits had made, like, it was easier for Dalits to be elected because of the change, or after the change, basically. I think this is partly because of the fact that because of changes in quota rules, because before the change, the quotas only encapsulated like minority groups, but like after the change, there were like quotas for like bound Kshatriya groups as well. So now like it made it easier for parties to have like Dalit and have like indigenous or Madhesi candidates in their elections as well, to run as candidates. Okay, so that was the second, and now I look into like share of plurality municipalities. So I first analyzed the local level. You can see this chart. This is basically charting the bar chart, like these small like boxes represent the national percentage, like the share of national population of different groups, and the blue line represents the share of plurality municipalities, meaning local governments that they were the biggest group in. And the reason why the biggest group matters is because if you're the biggest group in a specific area, for instance, you have a significant power in deciding what the political agenda is, what the representatives do, because the representatives cannot essentially get elected without like your community's support. So you have significant power in determining how like political outcomes, how political debates, discussions happen in your specific area. You can see there's a significant like the bound Kshatriya population, for instance, represent like the biggest group in 42% before the change, and like around 45 after the change, which is higher than their national population share of 30. For most of the other groups, it seems like generally being predicted by the national percentage share as well, except for like 4 groups here, where these groups are essentially have a much lower amount of municipalities that they have a significant say in, given their national population share. Like Dalits, for instance, specifically only represent a plurality in like 1 or 2% of the local government, even though they represent around 12% of the national percentage. So this is for the local level. This is for the federal level, where here I'm charting basically before and after the change. I'm charting different shares of federal electoral areas that different groups are the biggest group in, and the index delineates between what percentage they are from in the area. Basically, you can see, like, for instance, bound Kshatriya group represent around 50%. Around 50% of federal electoral areas where they are the biggest group. And remember, this was like 30% of the national population share. And on top of that, like this is, most of the areas, they represent over 40% of the population share, basically. And like the situation is again not very good for some groups like Dalits, Newars, and others. This group is slightly smaller in population, so this is not entirely unnatural, because they are have a smaller population as well. But even that, for instance, that did not stay after the change. Um, the change didn't really significantly affect the outcome or the electoral demographic political power um, in the federal level. Okay, so the provincial level. And the reason why, and I give like a special emphasis at the provincial level because like one of the major arguments for why like different groups wanted to go into federalism was that even though they represent smaller population in the national scale, for instance, they would represent a bigger population share at the provincial level, and they will definitely they will then have a bigger say in like how like budget gets distributed, for instance, what kind of policies get passed and stuff like that. At the provincial level, we see a very similar map as before. This is the same map that we had before, where the share of provincial electoral areas and where they are the biggest group in. And the index here is slightly different, where this represents the difference between the first and second biggest group. This means like the Baun Chetty group, for instance, represent the biggest group in 50% of provincial electoral areas, and they are the difference between them and the second biggest group is more than 20% in most of them, and less than 20, like 10 to 20% in around 12, 15% of the electoral areas, and less than 10% in very few. And you can see like similar trends as before here as well. This represents the same thing, but where the different groups are the second biggest group. Because even if you're the second biggest group, if you're very close to the first biggest group in terms of population share, then you kind of like do affect politics in a significant way as well. For instance, if you're the second biggest group and the difference between the first and second biggest group is just like 5%, then you're essentially the first biggest group as well. That you share that status with the group, right? Here, like for instance, Dalits represent the second biggest group in the most number of provincial electoral areas, but the difference between them and the first biggest group is more than 20%. So it's not really that significant in terms of say, in terms of political say. This is a chart showing different provincial areas and the groups that like represent the biggest group in the map that I showed earlier in specific provinces. So I want to point out two things here. So first, let's focus on this column, the difference column. The difference column is simply the difference between their population share and the share of provincial electoral areas that they're the biggest group in, plurality electoral areas. And you can see it is significantly higher for, like the blue represents if it's positive and the orange is if it's negative. And when it's blue, it's mostly for the Baun Chetri group, and it's also significantly bluer in the sense that like this is 30%, 29%. Other groups also have blue, but they're probably like 2%, 4%. It's not like very significant, except for this group, Madhesi group, which they represent a significant share of electoral areas in the province, in the Madhesi province, basically. The situation is only different in this province, but in like every other province, for instance, you'll see that other groups represent, like for instance here, like Mughals represent 10% of this province, but they only have like they have like 0% of provincial electoral areas that they represent the biggest group in the province. And you can see similar trends in other groups, other provinces as well. Finally, in the share of plurality electoral areas, this is another thing that was a major point of contestation during the implementation of federalism as well. What like different groups wanted like a bigger population share in different provinces so that they can control provincial political, like they can influence provincial politics as well. But like for like 4 provinces, if you look at for like the first 4 provinces, for instance, like 4 out of 7 provinces, more than 60% of provincial electoral areas have like substantive control or substantive influence from the Baun Chetri population. And this like kind of makes sense for these 2 provinces because they represent like significant share of the population as well. So it makes sense that they would have significant say. But for like these 2 provinces, for instance, even though they represent 35 and 36%, they are the biggest group in 64% of provincial electoral areas. For the other groups, they still represent like much bigger proportions of electoral areas than their population share would have predicted. And the situation is not as good for other groups, basically. This means, like, for instance, for 4 other provinces, you cannot essentially conduct a policy, or you cannot inflame the Bound Kshatriya group and still get elected into office, because they represent the biggest group in like 92% of areas, or like 64% of areas, 64% of, so you essentially need their consent to do anything, and you cannot do anything against their community, or like there's something that the community does not approve of. And the situation is not as true for other groups, where, for instance, they represent like 14%, 13%, and 24% of the areas. Okay, so the final thing is mean median difference, which is essentially a difference between mean and median. And the reason why mean median difference is interesting is because it represents the population share and how it is distributed. So if you have a higher mean median difference, that essentially means that, for instance, you can see here that like the mean median difference for this distribution is 0, almost 0, but here is higher. So a higher mean median difference indicates that the population share is concentrated around the left side of the graph. But if it's like a negative mean median difference, then it's concentrated around here. And you want the group to be concentrated around here, because then if most of the areas you have significant share, then you significantly influence political outcomes. But if it's concentrated around here, then you are like distributed in different areas, but you represent like very small share in all areas, basically. I measured the mean median difference for different groups at the local level, for different groups. And you can see in general, it doesn't seem that different for like the Bound Kshatriya and Dalit group, for instance. This seems to be mostly around 0, which means that they're not significantly disadvantaged by the distribution of population across municipalities. This is not as true for these groups, for instance. Madhesi groups there seems to be like significant number of districts where they are advantaged by the distribution, where there's like significantly negative mean median difference, which means they have a rightward skew in the distribution, which is beneficial. And there are a lot of indigenous groups, for instance, here that have a positive mean median difference, which is harmful for their demographic interest. Okay, that was it. We should do a quick break to get Chia and before the questions start.
So we have this year, which is to go rapid. Does anyone know more? Raise your hand. Oh, so just one. But please, if you have questions. So gonna. Think there are microphones on this thing, so people in the back. Feel free to ask questions.
Are people essentially just voting for candidates that are also from their social group? Like how, I guess just like broadly, like what types of candidates are running, like what political parties are there? And like, is there like a lot of crossover between like social groups? And like once a candidate is elected, like you said, they have to control the budget, like meaning like what, like they'll like explicitly preference like the social group that puts them in power. Like how extreme is it? Like how significant is it to have like an area being controlled by your social group?
So there's a couple of questions here. First, in terms of whether like people specifically vote for their social group, that is not as true in Nepal. People do not specifically vote for like specific person because it belongs to their ethnic group. That's not as true. I actually did math because I did not agree. the slides where I measured like at what percentage of population share your groups are more likely to like somebody from your ethnic group. And that usually is like around 40% for the volunteer group and like 60% for other groups. That is including the pieces, and I can share that for anybody interested, but I don't want to do that in slides. In terms of whether that actually affects political outcomes, that is not a super studied field in the Nepali academic literature. This is more of like more an issue of whether, for instance, I think that is more subtle, if that's what, because I don't think people's like there's no political discussion specifically saying I only want to favor like a certain group, I only want to favor a certain group. And they don't like explicitly do that in the budget as well. But it does ultimately affect like the area, the like where the budget is mostly distributed. For instance, if like a specific community has a hegemony in terms of division of budget, then that person would benefit like a certain community because it increases their chance of getting elected. And this also affects like who gets elected as well. So that's I think another question that I was saying.
In methodology section, there are like multiple things like and so mainly the question of causality comes in the section of difference in different. Others are mostly analysis. Like how do you find like how much like difference and similarity is in between the question of causality and just the analysis without causality?
Okay. So yeah, that's what interesting. So economics as a field is like very much like hell bent on causality. If you like publish a paper that does not try to prove causality, then like it won't get published basically, as opposed to like political science, where like that is still important, but that's not like the main question that they're focused on. They're focused more on like political. This thesis was political economy, so like kind of had like both approaches, where like, you take also like causal questions, but also like other questions that so like track. It is essentially more difficult to find that good causality. That's why like I only have one slide, like one methodology that essentially tried to prove causality, and even that did not like find any significant results. But I think there's still like value for like the non-causal questions, non-causal outcomes, because they show trends, they show associations, and like so like they show associations and how like power is distributed. Right?
Yeah, no, definitely like with that significant like difference in analysis also that's a lot giving to the literature.
I was just curious, there was one slide where like on the chart it said mountainous. Is that different? Is that the same thing that you brought up in the beginning?
Oh, okay.
Is that synonymous?
Hi, yes. So mountain indigenous is a composite of 10 different social groups that are indigenous to the mountain area. They're like specific. I don't have any specific list, remember. But the biggest group is like Sherpas, for instance, that are Eagle Monks. It basically is a composite of different groups because they individually they like a very small population share. So I thought if I combine them together, they would have more like find more like interesting results. But even collectively, they only represent like 1% of the population.
So that 1-2% fits within the 35%.
Yes.
Did you feel like did you have any issues in terms of like how discrete each of the different groups were like in collecting your research? So I think you mentioned like there were like different interpretations for how you different people. Like did you like I don't know, were there interesting crossovers? Because I'm just curious about like how fast it was like not just like playing a role in like one community, but how cast was like part of like even like the Muddy community or like, I don't know, like what, I guess what were your intentions? Like, how did you make choices about how to like split into areas?
Yeah, this was definitely a significant part of my work, the initial part of the thesis, because it was very confusing. There were like different papers, different things basically. I try to go in as simple of a grouping as possible because to make sure that like the grouping is not affecting the narrative. More specifically, there were tensions in the grouping of different groups. There are like specifically two instances, for instance, the reason of Dalit groups is basically comprised of like Dalits from the hills and Dalits from the plain as well. But that's not like a single group that represents like maybe like 30 different groups that have their own history and have like different occupational history as well and different histories of heritage within that group. But I think this still represents like what this still represents like the share of how political and socioeconomic empowerment has been distributed throughout history. At the plains, at the hills. And another issue I had was like some papers, for instance, in Nepali academic literature, combine all the indigenous groups into a singular category. And they divide into 2 or 3 based on whether they are like indigenous to the plain, mountain, and like hills. But I thought that even though that is like that's still relevant if you are doing a socioeconomic analysis of who is like better off economically, but if you're measuring like political empowerment, then these groups essentially are like it's extremely different from each other. So the empowerment of one group does not necessarily mean empowerment of another group. So I try to treat them differently. You think about whether it belongs the majority ethnicity or being a political party. Maybe you can have this party as people would like from so the first question, if I'm understanding the question correctly, I'll just try to like paraphrase what the question is. So I think the question is trying to say whether belonging to the majority ethnicity or being a political party increases your likelihood. So I definitely find that in the results that like if you belong to like the majority ethnicity, for instance, then you're like the likelihood of being elected is significantly higher. And this is because like throughout history, there's only like the realm of politics was limited to that specific ethnic group, and there's only very recently, like around 1990s, been opened up to other ethnic groups as well. And there's obviously in terms of the division of political power, actually that was a question I forgot about the last panel. But there's like there's like 2 huge parties, and there's like 5 different smaller parties, but still like significant 4. And if you belong to those groups, political parties, then the likelihood is definitely significantly higher. But there's like probably 100 different political parties. And so that definitely comes into the analysis. And I think there's a different interesting field of like analyzing what political party gerrymandering would look like in Nepal. That was like one of the major things that people recommended me to look into when I talked to them about the paper as well. But at the absence of data and time, I've not looked into that, but that's something like I think is a very interesting field of research for sure. The other question was if gerrymandering really did happen, which party or people would likely go. So that was like so that was what I tried to like address at that one section in terms of like the division of power and division of political power throughout history. I feel like would predict that the political power is still divided unfairly for certain communities, would benefit like the upper class community, would get harm like different ethnic groups or different like social groups like races and others. And I think to a certain extent that's what I found out as well. But there are definitely like more to look into this.
Obviously getting data was very challenging and you have connected. So if you had got data, and I don't know if you had or not regarding this question. So like conditional on the people who stood for the election, like the social groups who stood for the election, and like what was the relation between like who stood for the elections and winning the election. So one of the analysis that also could have been better data.
You mean like how candidacy is converted into like wins? I did a similar analysis where I basically measured how like a group share, population share is like correlated with who like which groups become candidates and which groups win the election at the end. But I think that is definitely very interesting. I don't know what kind of data you need, but I think they're very interesting.
I think we need like a bigger data from like all the political parties and then the election commission. I believe would be willing to give.
Yeah. The finding data is definitely like probably one of the most difficult part doing research in Nepal. So I think the government offices and government officers are very like, skeptical of like anything that is like Western or like foreign funded. So it seems like they have like an antipathy towards like, oh, what were you doing? What are you? So like even when like I went physically to a government office to collect it, I had to like basically like I had to like talk to the person for like 2 hours and just like talk to him about like his journey coming to the capital city. And like what it was like finally that had him give me the data. And this was like the national survey or something, like Central Bureau of Statistics, which like the only purpose is to give data. So I imagine like other government offices are even more less receptive to the idea of sharing data.
This is brilliant topic and study. I'm sure that this is very less studied subject involved. So on that terms, congratulations. This is very, very nice. I have a very limited understanding of this political space. But still, if you look at the Nepal's electoral architecture compared to the United States, this gerrymandering, no party has a control over what they do over gerrymandering and the outcome of that, right? And when Nepal turned into a republic state in 2008, since then we have seen almost 4 elections. No one party has a control over there's been a lot of coalition government. Almost every party took part in that over the since like for the last 12 years, 12, 13, 14 years. But this social inclusion was a prime agenda when the country turned into republic. And what you're showing is that I find it very interesting is that the total population share of the country is around 12% when you share. While their electoral representation is around 1.2%, which is completely against the whole idea why Nepal turned into republic. And at the same time, we had proportional representation in our system. How much that contributed, or have you also looked into that aspect, controlling over that? What if, how much that contributed to compensate what I mean, like to narrow that gap in terms of the share, the total share, the loss of population and the electoral.
Sorry.
I don't know if I'm up here.
No, that's very thank you so much. let me go back to that. And that would be good. So this is the graph we talked about. So I think the first thing I'd like to say is that this represents the share of local governments as the biggest group. This does not necessarily mean that like no Dalits would be elected in any of these municipalities, but they can, and they often do. What is more likely is, for instance, a group is majority for local government is majority Dalits, then it's likely that even if the final candidate who is not Dalit gets elected, they will still have to look after or cater to Dalit interests. They will still have to talk about Dalit issues to actually stay in power. So in that sense, it is significantly damaging that there are like very few municipalities that have like significant Dalit shares. In terms of proportional representation and the quotas, I think what you're leading to, there are definitely, I think quotas have made the whole system much more inclusive. There are like papers that I cited in the literature, the thesis that essentially show how local governments specifically have become much more inclusive today in terms of who gets elected to mayor. There's like specific rules about like that like a Dalit female has to be elected in every single ward as a they like specific quota basically for a Dalit female. So all these definitely are helpful, but I think I'm reminded of this paper that I worked used in my case as well, which said the agenda of inclusion has been limited like participation in political institutions rather than like significant decisive states. So for instance, so even though Dalits are included in the political discussion, which is like a huge upgrade from what was the case before 2007, before like 1990, where it was like significantly better that they're at least the table, but the person making the decision is still like a bomb chipping man at the end, which is damaging because like even like it is good that there's a voice, the inclusive voice, but it's more about whether you can actually contribute to actual social political policies with that voice is the question. And I think this result, from my understanding, is primarily because of the distribution of population. Like for the Bam, Kshatriya, and Dalit population, they usually are live next around each other. They're not like they're mostly distributed in the same geographical space, basically. And since they represent a smaller share of population than them, I think that is one reason why they represent a bigger share, and that is how like this difference got from here to there. One of the policy changes, for instance, that could like make this better is like in India, for instance, every 5 years, I think, or every specific number of years, like randomly 1/3 of the seats are just Dalit seats, and they're like they have to all the parties have to represent like elect like have a Dalit candidate basically. So like it could be any area electoral area, but they still need to have a Dalit electoral area and Dalit electoral candidate, and that is like randomly distributed throughout states every election cycle. And I think that's something that is like beneficial to them, like this made like development.
What else do you hypothesis, by the way?
But yeah, I did think like it would be like it would approximate the division of like caste ethnicity that we saw like here. Because even though like this was instituted 200 years ago, but significant changes to this hierarchy is very recent in terms of political discussion. Like people talk about caste ethnicity like people started talking about that very recently in terms of like Nepali history. 1990 is when like actually like university started talking about. I think Civil War also contributed to that very much. But I think I like still like very recent in terms of like Nepali political history that these issues haven't come about in the first place. So I think change would happen for take longer.
I think it's really interesting that you ground the like study in kind of like this concept from like derived from the US, like the disenfranchisement of Black voters and minority voters in the US. And I think it shows like just a general, I guess, lapse in like democracies around the world of like their inability to fulfill its democratic promise to minorities, and especially to marginalized groups. So I'm just wondering, like, in your research, you also like showed that there was kind of some inconsistency with comparing it directly to the gerrymandering of Black congressional districts or minority congressional districts in the US, just because of like the I guess shared disproportion in the like, amount that they overlap, or like the overlapping coefficient that you mentioned. So I'm just wondering, were there like other options that you explored in terms of other phenomena like gerrymandering in other parts of the world that you could have compared this to, or did you like, why were you compelled to kind of start this presentation with the conversation of gerrymandering and then show us, you know, what like the context in Nepal is like when it comes to voter disenfranchisement, or like, yeah.
I see what you mean. So the concept of gerrymandering, political discussion, academic discussion, legal discussion, in the last 10 years has significantly skyrocketed, especially in academic literature. But all the change, almost like 95% of the papers written on gerrymandering are focused on the US context. But where I think most of the political social discussion happens. But that doesn't mean to say gerrymandering does not happen in other societies. It probably does happen, but it would look very different. Because the US is a very special case in the sense that there's like there's two parties, and there's like the division of social group is also like around like 3 or 4 social groups, 4 racial groups basically. The context of Nepal is like extremely different in the sense there's like 100 different parties, 100 different ethnic groups, 100 different interests. So I had to like curtail a lot of what I learned from the US literature to get into what I know about Nepal. In terms of whether there were papers in other areas of the world, that is an area that I could not find as much, specifically looking at gerrymandering. There's definitely papers on like minority control, districts, minority power, in everywhere, like all over the world, but specifically looking into gerrymandering. I don't think there's any like actual paper that looked at gerrymandering in like, especially in the ethnically diverse context. Which is what I think is like one of the major like takeaways from this paper as well for like other societies, is that like gerrymandering might not look very obvious, especially in like ethnically diverse places where it's like actually very difficult to gerrymander. And as a point that you mentioned earlier, like Nepal, like there's not a political party deciding what maps will be drawn in Nepal. Like in the US, actually a political party actually sits down and says, this is the map I want, and they pass the map. The State House in Nepal, there was a commission formed in 2015. So that is a step towards more neutral map making. But I think this thesis is about like, even if you like actually stay in a commission room to discuss how you should draw the map, maybe there are like explicit active steps you need to take to redress like historical injustices to make it easier or make it like better or make it make certain groups like the distribution of power more fair, basically.
If you could extend this research, or like, I don't know if you have any thoughts about how you want to further apply this to political context. What are some extensions that you do based off this initial thesis?
So first thing I would do for sure is for this difference in difference analysis, I only use 2013 election data and 2017 election data. I would add 2007 election data and 2022 election data as well. I think that would make the results more interesting and more powerful. In terms of other things, I think for party gerrymandering would also be an interesting scope of research, future research, and that would essentially look very different from the party gerrymandering in the US, for instance. Because like much more, it's not just like two parties. It would look very different, but I think that would also be another. Because one of the people I talked about for this paper, he recommended I should look into the political areas, electoral areas for like the biggest leaders in political parties. And he suspected that like even if like the party's not gerrymandering everywhere, they would probably still be gerrymandering for the biggest political leaders. And like make their areas favorable for them. But that would be another.
Like before the next election, if you really do those things, and that would be interesting.
That would be interesting. I don't think this actually will affect anything. Which is like,
We have any control over, very different than the United States, right?
yeah.
They're busy criticizing
Okay.
what other.
Still, like, it's very interesting area.
This is like one of the major questions that I had in terms of like what I want to do in life. I think like the translation of academic findings into actual political change is like a very long process and sometimes a very uncertain process as well. When like even if you know something for sure in academic literature for like decades, like there's no like something strong get implemented for like decades or even like many decades. So like I don't expect this to actually change anything, but this is more about like my intellectual curiosity as like, oh, what's happening?
Are you looking for research projects? Is that what you're saying? It's gonna be good. Your stats.
Okay. You have any questions?
We have any coming in like 3 minutes. So you can stay for that. If you guys said it's vegetarian, so we have that. If no one has any questions, I also wanted to say, I think this may be the first event in this room in the 57-year history of the IOP that is focused on politics in Nepal. So I think that's a pretty cool thing. Based on my knowledge, I could be very wrong. But I think if there were discussions of Nepal in this room, they were always related to the US. So I guess we're making history today. It definitely is I think really nice to see this because we don't really see a lot of scholarship on like politics and governance in Nepal and just Nepali society in general, especially coming from Harvard, which should be, you know, an arbiter of that information because of our standing in the world and the resources we have. So definitely thank you for inspiring us to continue to look into these topics. And hopefully we can have more of these events in the future with the undergraduate Nepali Student Association. And
Thank you for joining everyone.
wait, let me check.